When people in this country think of empire, they tend to think of Kipling and Curzon and the Victorian period of guys in solo topies swaggering around with swagger sticks and empire-building shorts. They don't tend to think about the Elizabethan period, which in the popular imagination is a much more insular period. If it's gone out of the Anglosphere at all, it's in a conflict with the Spanish and the Spanish Armada, and it's Drake and Raleigh and all that sort of stuff. We have today two scholars who have totally broken that dichotomy, that image. Two remarkable scholars who, while being fully embedded in academia, write brilliant scholarly books that are accessible to anyone, that can be read for pleasure and win literary awards and are remarkable works of literature in their own right. They occupy adjacent territories. Jerry has concentrated more on Britain's relation with the Ottoman and Barbary worlds and the world of, in a sense, Western Islam, while Nandini has focused on the Mughal encounter with the Stuart world and with the Jesuits in Goa. And both the work of both scholars illuminate incredibly surprising moments in history when there is an openness and a porousness and a set of power relations that are quite different to what we expect, as is, I think, now well known after Nandini has book has been celebrated across the papers of every national newspaper. When the British arrive in India, of course, they are considered to be sort of dirty savages from some outer isle who have to beg and plead to be allowed access to the Mughal, and the attempts to create a trade deal have met very similar response to the trade deal currently under discussion with the Indian government, and has yet to be cemented and signed and sealed. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide the session in two, let each of these wonderful scholars give a 15 to 20-minute presentation on their book, then we'll pull it together, ask some questions, and then throw it open to you guys. So, Jerry, do you want to open up, first of all?
Thank you. Thanks, Willie. So what we're going to do, what we're going to do is literally split this in half, and I'm going to really talk about the Tudor moment up to 1603, so really from the accession of Elizabeth in 1558 to her death in 1603. And this remarkable moment where you have this kind of point of an Anglo-Islamic alliance that stretches really from northwest Africa right through to the Ottoman territories and also is getting into Persia. What Nandini is going to then pick up on really and talk about in terms of Roe is what happens post-1603. And it is a kind of watershed moment. You know, Elizabeth's death, the end of the Tudor period, and the accession of James I and Charles to come as well. So that's going to be another part of the story, and we'll probably talk afterwards about the significance of that really big shift that you get from Tudor to Stuart. But I'm going to start by taking you back to 1549. And this is an image by an English artist called Hans Ewert from 1549. So it's 9 years before Elizabeth comes to the throne. So we know that there are encounters, there are engagements between what you might call the Tudor polity and the Islamic world. We know, for instance, that there's a merchant called Anthony Jenkinson who gets as far as Persia with the formation of the Muscovy Company in the 1550s and early 1560s. So we can talk a bit about that, the way in which partly what this story is about is also a moment of reformation, the schism that takes place in Christianity between Catholics and Protestants from the Lutheran split in 1518. And what then happens, really interestingly, and what fascinated me, to bring in the story of the encounter with Islam, is that Catholic propaganda talks about Protestantism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, we're not using that term as yet, but that split, that emergence, that schism, they talk about what we would now call Protestantism as a heresy. They also talk about Islam as a heresy. So what you get is a conflation between Protestantism and Islam, particularly Sunni Muslim polities in this period. And that's what's really I'm going to talk about. but take you from, in effect, this image, a sort of fantasy image. Some of you will know this image. It's Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, painted by Hans Ewert in 1549. And I'm going to end with another portrait of another Muslim figure, and you'll see how far we've travelled between 1549 and 1600. But the next image is to think then about what happens. This is pre-Elizabeth. This is in the 1520s Catholic propaganda showing different heads of Luther. So this is a Catholic attack on Luther. But look at this image here. Luther wearing a turban. So this is the conflation that I want to talk about, the way in which Catholicism sees the heresy of Islam and the heresy of Protestantism as somehow connected and combined. Now, what's extraordinary about that is then we move into a later moment, which is Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. By 1570, the really watershed moment is she is excommunicated by Pope Pius. That's an extraordinary moment because what then happens is that Elizabeth is condemned as a heretic. She's condemned as a heretic, and through realpolitik, when you've got this moment, Willie mentioned, of course, the issue of Brexit, there's a kind of theological Brexit, right, that happens in this period. I mean, we can kind of go, ha, ha, but there is actually something that's really going on here, that the Elizabethans are cut out of Europe, okay, because of that moment of that theological split. And the excommunication that takes place in 1570 is very, very powerful, because what that means is that Elizabeth, and I think probably people like Walsingham and Cecil, say, look, the only way to deal with this is to try and reach out for other commercial markets beyond Europe, and particularly into the Islamic world. And by the late 1570s, Elizabeth is therefore writing to the Ottoman Sultan, Murad III. And I'm just putting up here the kind of contrasted letters that we can talk about afterwards, because we don't want to go on for too long. I want to get on with hearing what Nandini has to say. But on the left, you have Elizabeth's letter. And what's really interesting about it, if you follow the sort of clever theology of it, is that she's making a very strategic alliance, saying, you, Murad, rather like us as Protestants, are believers, we are people of the book. We reject idolatry, not like the Catholics, because they are our common enemy. This starts from 1579. Murad and Elizabeth then exchange letters throughout his reign and establish a very cordial alliance, which is both commercial and military. And on the right, we have the letters which come from the Kew Public Records Office. And I want to say, these are Murad's letters back to Elizabeth. You know, these are as important as thinking about Philip II's letters or what's going on with Spain, and that we've cut this out. This is what Nandini and I are going to say. This story is just being cut out of that history of the Tudors, rather shockingly. And to put these letters up against each other, I think is really, really important. What then happens as a result of that is a commercial alliance which is established from 1579, which goes on until 1922. So there is a capitulation, a signed commercial deal between the English and the Ottomans. Very much it's about the fact that the Ottomans are in charge. The Elizabethans are the subject nation. They're a vassal state. Elizabeth's very clear about this. And again, I think what we would want to say is we're looking at this period through the wrong end of the telescope, right? We see the Tudors as somehow really big here. They're not. I'm sorry, but they're not, okay? So William Harborne, who's the ambassador who goes to Istanbul in 1579, is going very much as a subject to the Ottoman terms and conditions. He establishes a very, very successful commercial and military alliance. The other Catholic states that are working in Istanbul are appalled by this. Because what's interesting is that having established this alliance between Protestantism and Islam, the Elizabethans can work outside the papal edict, which forbids trade between the two religions. So Elizabeth starts shipping lead, which is stripped from deconsecrated churches, to use for munitions in the Ottoman wars against the Persians and the Spanish. I mean, talk about arms to a rat. This is the 1580s. And all the Spanish and the Venetians are massively annoyed by this because they say, we can't do this trade. The Venetians, of course, have been quietly doing it for a long time. But that's a different story. But it becomes official, and Harborne is fronting these kind of exchanges. The English establish consuls across the Mediterranean. There is an open alliance. There's an understanding that that is a key commercial and military alliance. Harborne is involved in that alliance. He brokers a deal, a military deal, which is an attempt to split the Spanish Armada in 1588 based on an Anglo-Protestant Ottoman alliance against the Spanish. Now, this is a story about realpolitik, and I'm sure Nandini will talk a bit about this with Roe. But I'd also want to talk about some of the unintended consequences of the meetings, the exchanges, the encounters between Reformed Protestant English men and some women, and the Ottomans and the Barbary states as well. Because by this point, you've also got the alliance with the Barbary states, you've got the Barbary Company, the joint stock companies are really important here, the establishment of those kind of companies, which then build to the creation of the East India Company, and then that's a later story that Nandini will pick up on. So you've got the Barbary Company, which is also trading with the ruler of the region, Ahmed al-Mansur, who's trading gold that's going to London, and also spices, but also sugar. The great story about why does Elizabeth have rotten teeth? It's Moroccan sugar. And again, what's happening? The English, the Tudors, are shipping out arms to the Moroccans to fight against the Spanish. And then you've got conversions going on. We only have one story about a Muslim who converts to Anglicanism, which is in 1586, and I can talk about that. But we have a lot of stories of English men, and I suspect we're going to start finding English women, who from the 1570s are converting to Islam. And in the 1570s, if you're expecting the Spanish to come at any moment and take over England, and you think your Reformed Protestant religion is just going to get squashed, do you know what? If I, like this guy, was living in a palace in Algiers, I think I'd convert. This is a guy called Samson Rowley. Samson Rowley's from Great Yarmouth. It's true. It's true. Huh? Yeah, even Willie can tell. In 1577, he's on board a commercial vessel in the Mediterranean. He's captured by the Turks. He is castrated. He is a eunuch. Look at the picture. Look at the way in which he's represented. He's a eunuch. He then becomes the imperial treasurer. He converts. He then becomes Hassan Aga. He becomes the imperial treasurer to Algiers. And when the English ambassador, William Harborne, writes to him in the 1580s around captive narratives, and he says, do you want to come back? And he goes, mate, I'm living in a palace in Algiers. I'm not coming back to Great Yarmouth. Why would I? So we can talk more about the result of these kind of encounters and the kind of conversions that happen. But I just want to look at some other quick examples before I finish. This most extraordinary embroidery, this is from the 1580s. Would you believe it? This is in Derbyshire. This is in Hardwick Hall, right? Bess of Hardwick, Elizabeth Talbot, the Countess of Shrewsbury, created this embroidery in the 1580s. And what it shows is Elizabeth on the left, Fides, faith, with a representation of the prophet on the right-hand side, holding a book labelled the Quran, with the first representation in English visual culture that we know of a mosque. This is from the 1580s in Derbyshire, right? So I think, we're going to see that we're going to find more and more materials that are going to start to emerge to tell us a different story about this kind of encounter. It affects the drama of the period. We now know, both Nandini and myself, we work in this period on the literary work of the period. We know that from the 1580s, from Marlowe's Tamburlaine onwards, there is an avalanche of material about what we would now call Islamic characters and settings. I work out over 60 plays which have Islamic characters or settings from about 1579 to about 1640. It is the absolute fashion in the 1590s. So much it's the fashion, Shakespeare decides not to use Turks, but he represents Moors, which of course is another version of the encounter of the Barbary states anyway. And did you know that in Henry VI Part 1, and we can come back to it, but here we have it, Shakespeare, although I probably suspect Nash, because Nash was writing Henry VI, but who's read Henry VI? Who knew that they mentioned the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad in Shakespeare? Okay? We then can move on, we can talk about the connection with Persia, we can look at, and we're moving towards Nandini's area, because these are the famous Shirley brothers, and they're represented and mentioned briefly in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. On the left, Thomas Shirley. Thomas Shirley is a recusant, he's basically a closet Catholic who runs off in 1598-99, ends up working for Shah Abbas, comes back to Europe as his ambassador, and is trying to get this, broker a Catholic Shia alliance against Protestant Sunni Ottoman I mean, right? This is just quite complicated, right? And this is Shirley, who's an absolute rogue. And on the right is his brother Robert Shirley, the sort of Hello magazine of what I did when I was in Persia. So this was him painted by Van Dyck in 1622. And I kind of want to end with this figure. So look how far we've travelled from that 1549 image to end with this character and this painting, which is in the Shakespeare Institute in Birmingham. It's Muhammad al-Anuri. He's the Moroccan ambassador who comes to London in 1600, spends 6 months living on the Strand in the pay of the Barbary Company to establish a commercial and military alliance with Elizabeth. Art historians tell me that they don't believe this painting is real, that it's a fake or something, and I keep saying, yeah, that's because you're all sort of white art historians who can't accept that there could have been such an encounter, a high-level diplomatic encounter between Elizabeth and the Moroccan states to create a military alliance between Elizabeth and al-Mansur, who's al-Anuri's boss, against Spain. And they're talking about an invasion of Spain and also using the Tudor Navy to invade New World territories in the control of the Spanish. Al-Anuri spends 6 months living on the Strand. He meets Elizabeth in 2 high diplomatic meetings. The encounter only unravels because of the long-standing Ottoman alliance. Right? So Elizabeth doesn't want to prejudice that. She's 2 years away from dying. She then tries to turn Al-Anuri because she believes, and I love this, I love the story here, I think he's a Spanish Muslim. I think he's a Morisco because he shouldn't really be having his portrait painted. And I think he turns up and I think he's sent precisely to London because he is such a cosmopolitan figure who crosses language, crosses cultures, so he's the perfect go-between. And we're going to see a similar one when Nandini talks about Roe to some extent in a minute. So the alliance collapses, but it's purely because of the complex nature of the Anglo-Islamic alliance, which stretches right from Morocco all the way through to Istanbul and further east. And the last point that I'd make, I'd make 2 points. And Shakespeare writes Othello 6 months later. I'm not saying it's the model, but what I'm trying to say is that once you have that in mind and you realise that the Barbary states have been sending ambassadors throughout the late 1580s, 1590s, and Shakespeare's doing Titus Andronicus, and you have Aaron the Moor, and then another one comes in the mid-1590s, and you've got Shakespeare doing The Merchant of Venice, which is also a play about a Moroccan character, who comes to woo Portia. It's absolutely there, hidden in plain view. It's what Nandini and I will say. It's always been there. And the irony is that it only shifts. Elizabeth dies, al-Mansur dies, al-Anuri's boss. The Ottomans disengage and are talking and thinking more about Persia. Elizabeth dies, James comes to the throne. But the first thing that James does when he comes to the throne is he says, we can't sustain this theological Brexit from Europe. In 1604, the Treaty of London is passed. And that brings England back into the heart of Europe because they say, this is just killing us. It's not going to work. And that's where I end and Nandini starts next.
Wonderful. Goodness, that's a hard act to follow. Okay, so I am going to start off with these 2 pictures which I have got on my book. And I kind of like to think of them as the before and after photos of English encounter with South Asia, mainly. And that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about. So we're starting around the point where Jerry left off. Elizabeth I has died. There's been a huge onslaught of plague in London, so much so that James I's coronation, official coronation, has to be delayed by a few months. And then you have a new king on the throne. And new scandals and all kinds of things going on. But I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start in 1614. Imagine there's a caravan that's going from Isfahan in Persia to Lahore, and then the people from that caravan are going to go on their way to Europe, mainland Europe. Okay? And on in that caravan, astride on an elephant, is Jerry's man, one of the Shirleys. So that's great. You know, Robert Shirley on an elephant riding his way back from Persia to report back to his Spanish employers. And he happens, and this is, okay, can I admit this? This is every author's dream come true, okay? On that caravan route between Isfahan and Lahore, he meets an English author, okay? Not only does he meet this English author, the English author introduces himself to Robert Shirley, and Shirley opens his trunk, his luggage, and takes out 2 of the author's books that he has bought from London with his own money and carried all the way to Isfahan and is bringing it all the way back. That English author is this man, Thomas Coriat. He is on his own journey. So Coriat, who some of you may know about, is absolutely fascinating. He has nothing to do with trade. And nothing to do with the kind of political negotiations, so much so as he has to do with good food, travel, and earning a bit of cash on the side. He's a man after my own heart. He has set himself a wager that he's made his name already by walking around continental Europe, and now he's going to walk. And again, we go back to the theatre and the absolute awareness that the English have about Middle Eastern powers, essentially. He has seen the play Tamburlaine, and he wants to see the actual tomb of Tamburlaine. So he takes this walking trip, goes all the way across using the Venetian trade routes into the Middle East, and then he's going to make his way down to Mughal India. And that's the region we're talking about. Jerry was talking about the Ottomans. You can see the Ottoman regions right on this side, on the left-hand side. The Safavids are the Persians, Shah Abbas. And in the middle, you have that connection with Europe, essentially. On that side is where Tom Coriat is going, to the Mughal Empire. These 3 empires, along with the Ming in China, control most of global trade in this period. European trade has a tiny little toehold on that, and a tiny share of that entire global transaction. And there is a huge global kind of trade going on. It has been going on for centuries by this point. And that, again, is, I think, something that we tend to forget. But I digress. We're going to Delhi, right, from all the way down. In Delhi, we have the Mughals. Now, the Mughals are a fairly new dynasty. The way to kind of think about them is perhaps to think about their parallels in terms of who the kings and queens are, because let's face it, that's what we study about the Tudors in school and what we remember. So if we think about parallels, Elizabeth I is a direct contemporary of Akbar the Great. And this man over here is Jahangir, his son, Akbar's son, who's a direct contemporary of James I. And we can talk about this later. There are kind of really interesting, uncanny similarities between James I and Jahangir in terms of their liking of hunting, their deep dislike of tobacco, all kinds of things. But the Mughals, as a new-ish force, are particularly interesting because they're a Sunni force. So if I go back to that map, we've got the Ottomans, who are Sunni Islamic, who are a Sunni Islamic empire, global power. We have the Mughals, who are Sunnis. The Safavids are kind of stuck in the middle as the Shia empire, in the middle of them. But the Mughals don't care about those distinctions. What the Mughals want to emphasize is not only their heritage, their dynastic heritage, but they're kind of global presence. So these two images are particularly interesting because in one of them you have an Ottoman Sultan. You can recognize him by his turban, waiting patiently in a queue, while Jahangir studiously ignores him. This is a painting called The Emperor Jahangir Preferring a Sufi Sheikh to Kings. And in the front left corner, you can see James I with the disgruntled face of someone who's been waiting a bit too long for a bus. And on the other side, we've got Shah Abbas being embraced by Jahangir. Jahangir is drawn slightly taller and with his feet firmly planted on the subcontinent. So this is the world that the English want to enter. Jerry's talked about that break from continental Europe. You know, what do you do when your trade sources dry up? You look for new trade deals in the global south. And that's what happens in this case. The English are desperate to make connections. They're particularly desperate to find a market for English wool. You would probably think that Ajmer and Delhi in the summer is perhaps not the best place to go. But hey, you've got to try. So the East India Company, who have got their trading license right at the tail end of Elizabeth's reign, have been rooting for about a decade by the stage that the empire, well, the state, essentially, the monarch, needs to put a little bit more support into English trade with South Asia. And finally, James I agrees, but he's a bit cash-strapped. So he says, look, okay, I'll appoint an ambassador so long as you pay for him, because that's not an expense I'm going to support. What I will support, though, is to give him a set of instructions. And I just thought I'd put this on because, I don't know, it amuses me greatly. So this is part of James I's instructions to the man my book is about, Thomas Roe, who's the first English ambassador to go to Mughal Empire. And James tells him, okay, so these princes are most apt to seek and maintain correspondence with the greatest and mightiest princes. Okay, so probably best you don't tell them that we're from a small island. Tell them about our sea power, that sounds much better. Tell them that I'm among the greatest princes of Christendom, and that makes us even a terror to all other nations. Okay? But when you stop, remember to conclude with the fact that we are not only absolutely obeyed, but universally beloved and admired of all our people. So Roe, my man Roe, when he goes to India, funded by the East India Company, but with that brief to convince the Mughal Empire, has a tough job because he's coming from a very, very small island to this. He's coming to an empire that rules about 150 million people, whose annual revenue, the emperor's annual revenue, he's already been briefed by the other East India Company merchants, is about 54 million pounds per year, equivalent of about 10 times the entire national income of England. And he's coming on the funding of trading company that doesn't want to spend much. This particular, you did a nifty thing of pointing the light. How do we do that? The laser.
The one that says laser. We should work together more.
I know. So there you go. That person there, we think, is the only Mughal portrait of Thomas Roe, waiting there patiently with what looks...
Is that a new discovery, by the way? Have you seen that?
It's something, about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
With a petition in his hand, and what my students are convinced is a mobile phone. But it's particularly interesting because for the Mughals, the English are very small fry. They've seen the Portuguese. They know the kind of havoc the Portuguese have caused down the west coast of India. So they really don't want any other European forces to actually settle. B, they've never really heard of the English. And there's a C, which Roe gets to later on, which is that the gifts that they have brought are dreadful. So Jahangir isn't particularly interested. What they're interested in, though, is the way they use the cultural material that the English have brought with them. So you have this, in fact, is a very, very recent discovery. This was identified and sold at Christie's about 8 months ago. And it's drawn by a Mughal portrait artist called Bichitra, who is an amazing artist, actually, who painted that central image as well. And my contention is that this is a copy of the De Kritz portrait of James I that Roe takes with him as a gift from his embassy. So for the Mughals, the English are a curiosity. They are the sieve-wearing Kula-Pushans who wear stuff on their head and insist on wearing wool in the summer in Delhi and try to sell wool to the Mughals. Roe's main emphasis is a trading license. So what he wants, right, you have to have a little bit of ambition, isn't it? So he's not satisfied with just getting permission to trade. What he wants to do is uproot the Portuguese altogether. He wants an exclusive trading license. He's not going to get that. In fact, the English don't get that at all. What Roe ends up doing in his little house, and this is where there is a huge difference between the people like Hassan Aga or Samson Rowley, whose portrait Jerry showed you, who is taken by the Ottomans and then rises through the Ottoman rungs in terms of his career, and the Englishmen who come to India as merchants and factors. The English who come to India do not have an easy life. They all live together in a really tiny, cramped house, which is also their warehouse. They're constantly haggling with merchants, the Gujarati merchants, for instance, who hold the purse strings. They're trying to decipher the really elaborate diplomatic codes through which Mughal administration moves, and it is hugely complicated. And in the middle of all that, there is Thomas Roe, the man with 2 or let's say 3 masters, his king, the company, and his kind of demand of social life as well, in terms of his connections at court in London. And he's desperately trying to balance all of those. So this particular letter is Roe grumbling to the East India Company, so to the bosses at home in London. In fact, in the city, in Philpott Lane, where the East India Company had its offices, grumbling about the merchants in India, the English merchants in India, and saying, look, they are a bundle of contradictions, they don't listen to me, they don't take my advice, they run off and do risky trade deals, they get drunk and cause trouble. I don't know what to do with them. And when he doesn't squabble with the East India Company merchants, he's grumbling about the presents. This is one of his early letters, and he says, the presents you of this year sent are extremely despised by those who have seen them. The lining of the coach and cover of the virginal scorned, being velvet of these parts, and faded to a base stony. So the English think that it would be a really good idea to send a really flashy carriage to the Mughal Emperor. Which, good idea, sounds good. Except that it had to spend 6 months in the hold of a ship going around the Cape Horn. So by the time it came out, Jahangir took one look at it, said, thank you, very politely. He had been brought up well in the Mughal harems, and then proceeded to reupholster, basically remake the whole thing. So the whole thing was reupholstered in Indian velvet, and the iron nails replaced with gold and silver nails, and then he proceeded to make 2 even better copies. Here are nothing esteemed but of the best sorts, good clothes and fine and rich pictures, they coming out of Italy overland and from Hormuz, so that they laugh at us for such as we bring. So there's a point where Roe ultimately writes to the East India Company and says, look, please don't send me any more knives and mirrors. No more knives and mirrors. We're sick of them. We can't shift them anymore. Just send someone with £100 to the German tech fairs. And Germany did have huge fairs of technological innovations, and get a few gizmos. My man Jahangir here likes a few neat tricks like that. So get him a few scientific curiosities and he'll be happy. So what do the English get then if they don't get a trading license? Well, they get for the first time a close-up view of how Mughal statecraft works. They find out more about the man in the center, Jahangir, who's absolutely fascinating, hugely underrated, I think, in terms of Mughal history. People pay a lot of attention to Jahangir's father, Akbar the Great, and his son, Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal. And poor Jahangir kind of fades away in the center, but he's absolutely fascinating. And one of the great things about writing about this period is that very rarely do you get material where you can almost track hour by hour, day by day, from the English and the Indian perspective. Because Roe leaves a daily journal. That's part of his job in kind of employment deal, essentially. The East India Company wants to ensure that he is earning his money, so he has to write a daily journal. But Jahangir it follows his ancestor Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty's example, and also writes a daily journal. He doesn't mention the Mughal Emperor, the English ambassador, at all. Spends a lot of time mentioning his pet storks, but English ambassadors? Nope, none of it. The person on this side is Nur Jahan, Jahangir's favorite 20th wife, who by this point is essentially the Empress of India, along with Jahangir. And for Roe, coming from Stuart, England, and this is why it's also really interesting to put England and London side by side with Mughal India, because you can see where English perceptions develop from. So later on, in the 18th and 19th century, there'll be a whole narrative about effeminate Mughal powers, that the Mughals are always ruled by their women. Roe goes to India at a point where his own country, and particularly his own crown, is falling apart because of internal fights between the king and the queen. James I does not get on with Anna of Denmark, his queen. And they have a huge kind of conflict, long-running conflict, right from their early days, about the upbringing of their 3 children. Okay, one of whom will become Charles I later on. So when Roe goes to India and sees the Mughal, hears about the Mughal harem, hears about the women within the Mughal harem, how they can influence politics and power, he thinks, this is exactly what's wrong with power itself, with monarchy. And he makes an example out of the Mughal Empire in a way that he can't with James, because that would be slightly tricky, given that James is the person who's made him an ambassador. And then the third person is Prince Khurram, who will become Shah Jahan. So again, for Roe and for countless Englishmen who follow him, the whole idea of the negotiations and the poisonous politics within India is built on Roe's perceptions of what he wants to see within the Mughals. And I'll just show you this picture. This is another thing which is perhaps slightly counterintuitive to our expectations. On this side, on the left-hand side, is a Mughal painting from a Persian translation of the Ramayana, which is one of the ancient Hindu epics. And it is a depiction of Rama meeting a hermit, Vashishta. On the right-hand side is an image of Jahangir meeting a hermit, a Hindu hermit he used to have long conversations with, and Roe is one of the people who write about this, a Hindu hermit called Jadrup. So for the English, going from this little island where there is a fairly strong clampdown on any kind of religious diversity, India is a weird place. Because the Mughals, by this stage, had already realized that you can't impose Islam on this huge landmass. It's just not going to be possible. Aside from that, Akbar and Jahangir are both deeply interested in religious and philosophical variations. So they're interested in having those conversations around different religions. Tom Coriat, the writer that we talked about right at the beginning, who had come down to Ajmer by this point, has, I suppose the only way to put it is, has a bit of a spat with a Mughal imam about the relative merits of Islam and Christianity, as you would do if you're in a foreign country and isolated. Why wouldn't you have a spat? And at the end of writing about this, he says, only in Mughal India I could get away with doing this, probably, because here you can have these discussions in a way you can't elsewhere. So, I'm going to come to that last image. This is in the Houses of Parliament in St. Stephen's Hall. At the end of the First World War, morale is a bit low, and the government decides that the best thing to do is commission a series of murals in the Houses of Parliament which will make Britain great again, as you do. So you have huge towering murals of King Arthur, of the signing of the Magna Carta, and among them is this one by an artist called William Rosenstein, who himself is an immigrant artist. He's a second-generation immigrant. And this is a painting of what the English wanted to remember of this first English embassy, of Roe meeting Jahangir. Jahangir is all attention. He's kind of sitting up, waiting for this letter, to receive this letter, rather than Roe standing in the corner with his petition or his mobile, whatever it might be, in that earlier Mughal painting that we've seen. And this is the way we perhaps remember the embassy, in as much as we remember it, as the beginning of empire, rather than this really shifty, unstable moment when you're kind of going to and fro, and Roe is constantly packing up his stuff, ready to leave, essentially. Thank you.
We've gone a little over time, but I might claim director's privilege and extend it by 10 minutes. So if you, do we have a session immediately after this? When does it begin? What time is it now? 5. Okay, we've got 10 minutes. we will be. All have to rush out. We got Sandra, 10 more minutes.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
10 more minutes.
Good. Okay. You came just at the right time. So first of all, we haven't actually got some figures. Give an idea of the relative, both of you, the relative size of the British economy and the Mughal and the Ottoman and Barbary economies at this time.
Well, what's interesting is that the Levant Company emerges in 1592 because it conflates the Turkey and the Venice Company, because the Turkey Company is basically 3 to 1 bigger than what's going on with the Venetian economy, with the money that's coming in. Yeah, so, again...
3 times as much British trade with the Ottomans as with...
Yeah, than with Venice. So, again, we've misunderstood how those kind of connections are working. Right? So the Barbary Company as well, the trade that's coming in is bigger than the trade with Portugal that the English are undertaking at that point. So, yeah, exactly.
So not in our textbooks.
No, of course it's not. Of course it's not in the bloody textbooks, no.
Nandini, relative size of Mughal and Tudor economies, or Stuart economies.
Well, as I said, I mean, the Mughal Empire, the emperor himself has an income which is about 10 times the entire national income of England in this period.
The emperor himself.
The emperor himself. So this is his personal income, essentially.
10 times the entire economy of England. Yeah.
But
And
also,
the Mughals making about 40% of world GDP or something, some figure like that.
yes,
is around,
but I suppose the other interesting thing is, and this is something which is harder to track, in the sense that when we talk about Venetian or Portuguese trade, part of that trade is also Middle Eastern trade. So one of the big things that's happening here is an absolute drain of silver from Europe into these Islamic empires in this period.
And again, we haven't dealt with sort of military, because again, people think of the Victorian period and the balance of power at that time. But just to spell it out, you've got Barbary pirates from Algiers, from Salé, raiding Stepney, Cornwall, Dublin, and taking slaves from Britain. Just talk about that very briefly.
Well, just that scale of conversion that's going on from the 1570s, again, is just not part of the story that we're told about. But, and again, of course, it's because of, Nandini was kind of indicating this, the slipperiness of religious identity at this period, to be a Protestant, are you a Calvinist, are you a Lutheran? There's a great moment where Harbon says, I'm really, really annoyed because everybody in the Ottoman Chancery is saying I'm a Calvinist, I'm a Lutheran, and I'm absolutely not, I'm a Calvinist. And you think, that's extraordinary that level of understanding of theology is at work, but also then the slipperiness of conversion in this period. We're replete with Catholics converting to Judaism and vice versa, and Protestants to Catholic and to Islam as well. So this is happening throughout the Mediterranean period, and we know this. Nabil Matar has done this brilliant work on captivity narratives from really the 1570s, 1580s. And then in the early 17th century, you've worked on this more. It just becomes a sort of mass thing. And you clearly see that people are thinking in the 1570s and 1580s, I'm completely convinced by this by looking at the accounts. You just think at any moment that Protestantism in England is going to be snuffed out. Elizabeth's state is a rogue state. They're seen as funding terrorism in the Low Countries. That's really how the rhetoric is being used by Catholicism. And that it will be snuffed out. There will be an armada. It will wipe out Protestantism. And Catholicism will return. So at that moment, contingently, people are probably thinking, you look at Islam, Sunni Islam, and of course, there's an awareness of the distinction between the two. I've got Anthony Jenkinson in the 1560s talking about the distinctions between Sunni and Shia theology. This is a Tudor tradesman in the 1560s talking about that. And our foreign policy, doesn't even understand those distinctions today. So think about,
what George Bush famously didn't know there was a difference between Sunni and Shia. Before invading Iraq.
Awkward that.
And Nandini, again, military power, the Mughals. Give just a brief description for anyone that may not know it about what happens when Joshua Charles thinks it's a great idea to invade Mughal India and sends sort of a bunch of Tudor men with pikes to try and take on the Mughals.
Well, even better than that, there's a moment during Roe's embassy where one of the East India Company ships land in Surat, and they think it would be a great idea to send 25 people from the ship with their guns. They've got guns and swords, Willie. What could go wrong? To take the whole of Surat. It does not go well for them. The problem is that, particularly with India, because the Portuguese have been there for quite a long period, over a century by this stage, and Portuguese intelligence about internal Indian politics is very carefully regulated, the English don't really know much, apart from the fact that there's money there that they would quite like to get their hands on. So there's a huge amount of a weird kind of tension between over kind of imagining of abundance that everyone eats in gold and silver platters once they get to India, and on the other hand, absolute lack of knowledge, really.
And when when Roe finally gets to meet Jahangir, the only thing that seems to interest Jahangir of all the things that Roe has to say is his description of brewing.
Yes.
He's very interested in English beer. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Well, I suspect that's partly because Roe does take some wine with him, but it's Spanish wine, and it goes bad on the way. So Jahangir opens one bottle, has half a cup, and then politely returns the whole bottle back to Roe. So, I mean, what's the man going to talk about? He ends up talking to Roe about, what do you drink in your country? How do you brew it? And they have a lovely discussion about, chat about beer.
And this whole idea of Brexit, the Reformation cuts off Britain from mainland Europe. And so its only option is to, it's a very similar situation. Just to enlarge on that, the only option is to make alliances with Morocco because it can't deal with most of southern Europe.
Yeah, and the first moment is the joint stock companies. So you were talking about this, the way in which the state will, Elizabeth and then James will support the joint stock companies. And then, of course, there's deniability. If it goes wrong, they can say...
That's the interesting... Also, it is, but joint stock companies, so it's a kind of privatised imperialism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and of course it starts with the Muscovy company in the 1550s, which is... We misunderstand it because we think it's Muscovy, so it's going to Russia. But Jenkinson is trying to get to Persia.
Yeah.
And, of course, that overland route through Moscow, there's a great moment, he meets Suleiman, then he meets Ivan the Terrible, then he meets the Tsar. So, I say he meets a Sultan, a Tsar, and a Shah in 10 years. And he's basically the kind of Marks and Spencer, buyer for silk. He's extraordinary. Amazing.
Yeah.
But the problem is that route is not sustainable. So they know that obviously they have to circumvent the European markets because they're just being locked out by the 1550s.
This, I think, is very important because people in this country look on the rise of India as something weird and strange, rather than seeing it as it actually is, as a return to its natural place in the world, producing half the world's manufactures with a huge proportion of the world's population.
The huge amount of Red Sea trade, for instance, that was going on long before even the Portuguese come there. There's a reason why the Portuguese decide that that coast of Goa is going to be a good place to settle, because it gives them an entry into controlling that Red Sea trade.
And enormously increases their fortune.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to hand straight over, sir, in the front row. You've got in first. We've got 5 minutes for audience questions.
Hi. Thank you very much, Nandini and Jerry and William as well. My question is actually about Noor Jahan. I was excited to see the picture, which is in the Raza Library. And something that Jerry said, which made me think, that period, you're quite right, was quite misogynistic towards women, and the idea of women rulers here was disparaging, not to say the least that Thomas Roe wrote quite disparagingly about Noor Jahan in the little that he wrote about her. Going back to what you were saying, is there a particular link? Because Noor Jahan, of course, was born in Kandahar and came from Shia stock. So do you think that would have also... It's an odd link, but the link that you were talking about Shia Islam not being in favour over here, or just before that period, is there any particular link there? And also, just if you can't, then just to tell a little bit more about Noor Jahan and link it. Thank you.
Well, you can do that, but just first, I'm not sure about the link, but the interesting story, of course, is that Elizabeth, once Murad III dies, his mother is pretty much running the show, and Elizabeth carries on the correspondence with her. So that then becomes interesting as these two women who are running those states, and the alliance has been established.
Minted on coins at the time as well.
Sorry?
Both of them being minted on coins, Elizabeth and Noor Jahan.
And then it's interesting about the objects and the material objects that start getting exchanged, including the coach. So there's a context there. And then, of course, this great story that she sends a Lancastrian called Thomas Dallam with a mechanical organ to play in front of the new Sultan and the Sultana. And, Dallam turns up from Warrington with this mechanical organ, plays it. The Sultan goes, it's absolutely great, shows him the harem, and he says, do you want to stay and convert? And he goes, no, I'm going back to Lancashire, if you don't mind. And then
one of the trumpeters...
He's sent with what he calls a perfect Turk, who is his guide to getting back through Eastern Europe. And on the way, he discovers that the perfect Turk is from Chorley in Lancashire, down the road from where he lived. And again, this is in 1599. And, so it's bedrocked on that exchange between the two women, which is in itself, I think, is really interesting. And alongside the fact that it discloses, because we talk there about gender, but we're also not talking at this point about class. But it's interesting that you've got, two working blokes from Lancashire, one who was converted converted to Islam, Sunni Islam, and the other who's not, who just says, I want to go home. I just think that's such a great story that I think more and more we'll find out about that. And also, I think the questions about gender and representation, which again,
I think
still,
that's
so
really
you
interesting, and particularly because Noor Jahan is, you could think of Noor Jahan as an anomalous case, and so with Sophia Sultana to some extent. The class and their political position sets them aside. But we talked about Robert Shirley. The person we didn't talk about is Teresia, his wife, who's a Circassian woman who he marries and brings over to Europe. Just before Thomas Roe goes to India, about 2
Hawkins
years...
has an Armenian, doesn't he? He comes back with an Armenian wife.
That's
given
right.
to him by Jahangir.
And that's exactly it. There's a man called William Hawkins who had already been at the Mughal court, and he marries an Armenian woman who has grown up in the Mughal harem. And that Armenian wife comes back to London. So there's a moment 2 years before Thomas Roe is about to go to India where, if you were walking around Philpott Lane in London, in one house there was a woman who had grown up in a Mughal harem called Mariam Begum. In another house, further down the river, was a Native American princess called Pocahontas at the same time.
And we have Robert Truly, the trumpeter,
Exactly.
who converts to Islam and goes off to the Deccan.
Oh, there's a huge number of these ordinary men, as Jerry said, who go to...
You get rich quick in India.
You get much more money. Roe is so annoyed when the coachman he had taken with him decides to take up employment with Prince Khurram, because he's going to be paid more than Roe is going to be paid. So annoying.
Guys, we have a million questions that I'm sure all of you want to ask, but they will be signing books downstairs in the book tent. My books have run out, so I'm not going to be there. But these guys would love to sign. So please, any of you have any questions, please come straight to the book tent now. There'll be a big signing. They'll be happy to answer any of your questions. But in the meantime, a huge round of applause for Jerry Brotton and Nandini Das.